There's a man buried in Chicago. He died in 1932. Born poor in Indianapolis 53 years earlier, his life would be one of greatness and suffrage. Marshall Major Taylor was the fastest man on two wheels. He was a world champion cyclist in 1899. He lived in a time when a black man racing in the sport of cycling was not just rare, it was dangerous. He was a boy from Indiana who trained in secret, sprinted in silence, and let his legs do the talking. At 13, performing cycling stunts in a military uniform outside a bike shop, he earned the nickname that would follow him forever. By 18, he was setting world records. By 20, he was a champion. By 21, the world knew his name. But many at the time refused to honor him. In fact, many times he faced the opposite. He encountered closed doors, threats on the track, and racism that chased him even when the race was over. But still, he rode, not just to win, but to prove to the world that he belonged. And he won, time and again. Cycling in those years was simply the most popular sport in the world. More popular than soccer, more popular than boxing, and more popular than baseball. And because of that, Major Taylor was actually the highest paid athlete in the world. He was that well known. But he didn't let that get to his head. The race he rode was uphill and against the wind. Today, Major Taylor is largely forgotten by the country he once awed. But his story still rides on, in the wind, carried on by those who remember. In this episode, I sit down with John Howard, a man who spent years uncovering the truth behind Major Taylor's extraordinary life. Together, we talk about the boy who defied the odds, the man who rode with dignity, and the legacy that refuses to die. Because although Major Taylor passed away from this world in 1932, penniless, alone, and largely unrecognized, he died with the heart of a champion. Today I have Mr. John Howard here with me. Mr. Howard, you were born in Missouri. You're a three-time Olympic cyclist. You have 19 elite and masters national championships. You are a Hawaiian Ironman world champion in 1981. You have set world records at both ends of the spectrum of madness, someone wrote, at a speed of 152.2 miles per hour and an endurance distance of 539 miles in 24 hours. That, more or less, is the distance from New York City to Raleigh, North Carolina, or Los Angeles to Reno, Nevada. Actually, a little bit further than that. In 1989, you were induced into the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame, along with Major Taylor, your childhood hero. How did he become your childhood hero?
I did a little bit of research because I enjoy reading and going to the library, and I would find little bits and pieces. You know, there were really important athletes of that period in the 1890s, and cycling was a very big sport, probably bigger than baseball at the turn of the century, and I could explain why that. It was the NASCAR of its day. It was the excitement. Going to a baseball game was like watching grass grow compared to cycling. Cycling was just dynamic. And the heroes of that era were long gone, but one stood out, and that was Major Taylor, who was an African American and fought racism in that era on all fronts. I mean, he couldn't stay in hotels. He was not allowed to dine with the other cyclists of that period, and he really was suppressed in many ways. But I was very much into the I was very young in the 1960s, but I followed the civil rights, arranged to actually follow it by TV. We were poor. We didn't have much in the way of communications in the 50s and 60s. But what I did was I reached out and I searched for the athletes of that era that represented the United States and were acclaimed. There was Frank Kramer, and then there was Major Taylor. Those were the two that I found. And when I started doing this research, again, Major Taylor came back, and I had a stellar career as a cyclist. And from that, I started doing some additional research on Major Taylor. So he was, yes, my boyhood hero. And when I managed to come across his original autobiography, which was published by his own publication. He actually went out and used up the last of his funds actually to create this autobiography, and it's ponderous material. It's hard to get through, but excellent in terms of what it documented through his career. So when I started reading that, I really got excited about it and could start to understand the scale of cycling at the turn of the century. And from that, I fashioned my own career in the sport and was quite successful and won some major events, had an opportunity to race in Europe. I was part of the very first U.S. team to compete abroad, and we were successful. I took a third place in the international Raleigh International, actually it was the Nissan Tour of Ireland at the time, and that was a big international race, and I got third, which put me on the podium, which was again a hallmark in American cycling. You had to buy your own equipment. There was no money per se in the sport, and you might win a toaster from Sears and Roebuck if you won first place. So there was no money. We did it for the love of the sport. We competed. And finally, I had an opportunity to race on the Pan American Games team in 1971. There were two events that put cycling on the map. One was Jack Syme's silver medal in the World Championships in Uruguay, and the other was my gold medal in the Pan American Games in Cali, Colombia. And from that, there started a chain of support through the United States the United States Olympic Committee, and cycling was now being funded. So I helped bring that on, and real money started trickling into the sport, which of course led to bigger and better things for the future. The Motorola team, eventually the U.S. Postal team that Lance Armstrong rode for. And I was part of that team, and my career lasted a very long time, and to some degree, I suppose, continues today, even as a masters athlete. I really enjoy recreational cycling. I'm not quite as keen about racing anymore, but to sum it up, I have 520,000 miles on my clock, and I did that with all original parts. I've never had anything replaced. So
I think I heard you say that before, 520,000 miles, and I calculated it to see how many times around the world do you think that is?
I'll rely on you for that answer.
You've ridden around the world over 20 times. So the circumference of the earth, 520,000 miles, you have to go around the earth over 20 times to reach that number. So that's incredible. That is amazing. So Major Taylor was he was an African-American man born in Indianapolis. He was born in Indianapolis, one of 8 children. His father was a coachman for a wealthy family, the Southards in Indianapolis. Can you give me that part of his life? His father became a coachman. Major Taylor became a friend with the Southards' son. I think his name was Daniel Southard, and they kind of took him under their wing and educated him somewhat, gave him his first bicycle, which got him into cycling.
Right. Well, the senior Southard, the father, the patriarch of that family, was a railroad executive in an era when railroads were, that was transportation for the masses. So he was quite wealthy. He had a paid tutor to look after his son, and Major Taylor was brought in. The story that I remember and is told in the book, The Black Cyclone, is the story of how Mr. Taylor, Gilbert Taylor, who, by the way, was a Civil War veteran. Well, let me just back up a little bit. It was a horse convention in Indianapolis, and it was in a closed arena, and a fire broke out, which, of course, with all that hay is, extremely dangerous. And Gilbert Taylor, who was a skilled coachman, among other things, he had in that era, you had to be good at a lot of different tasks in order to survive. And he immediately got the fire put out, stomped it out, and as a result of that, Mr. Southard hired him on the spot to be their coachman. And I'm not quite sure how all of that evolved, but it did. And it turned out that Mr. Southard's son was 9 years old, which was the same age as Marshall Taylor, who was also 9 years old. So they had a reunion, or not a reunion, but a gathering where this is period humor. They dressed them both up, unbeknownst to each other, in the same outfit, which was sort of a nautical costume. And Major Taylor, or Marshall Taylor at the time, went to the front door, and they asked Dan Southard to go answer the door, and he did, and there was his smiling black twin standing there at the door. They all got a huge kick out of that. at the expense of the two kids, I'm sure, who were totally perplexed by it all. But that's how they met, and that story is told in the book. But what was important was that he did get this tutored education, and you'll read all about the tutor that they hired. Myronov was his name. He was a Lithuanian Jew, and he educated the kids in what he believed was their correct direction or aptitude. And in the case of Marshall, it was engineering. He felt that was the direction that he could go. He was good at math. He could do things quickly. And he felt that engineering was the direction that he would push toward. But he also educated them in terms of grammar and literature. And Marshall grew up with the belief that it was important to respect your elders. He had all those. I mean, his family had given him that direction, and he was totally committed to his family. They were a Christian family, Baptist by brand, and Taylor believed that it was important to honor his parents in terms of what their wishes were, and his mother told him that you rest on the Sabbath. It's important to rest on the Sabbath. So that was where he was headed. And this direction would serve him well later when he started racing bicycles, because it's because of the heathens that he was dealing with on the circuit. These were some rough and tumble athletes. Athletes of the day were a whole different mix than they are today. They were not clean living. They drank whiskey and they swore and they cursed. And Major Taylor had a totally different direction, and he would use verse to try to pry them from their heathen ways. But it actually ended up alienating them against him in many respects.
He had that education. He was given a bike by the Southards, which he thoroughly enjoyed and loved. He learned to do tricks on the bike. He would do things on that bike that no one else could do. He was about, I think, 11 to 13 in that age range when he was learning all of that. And then the family moves to, they leave in Indianapolis, I think to Chicago, and then he still has the bike. He goes to like a bike shop in Indianapolis and gets hired on by one of the bike shop owners because he thinks that he can get more customers in the door. So Major Taylor would be outside doing tricks. And I read a story that he was wearing some sort of major's uniform, like an army uniform shirt. And then they started calling him Major Taylor after that. Is that how is that true?
Roughly, yes, Seraphin. That pretty well defines it. What happened was the bicycle was a trick bike. It was designed with, of course, a single speed. That's all they had in the day, but it was a very low gear. It was low gear for tricks. Trick bikes were used for skill set improvement, and eventually he became an instructor and taught other people how to ride. But in that era, Sam Hay, who was the bike shop owner at Willits and Hay bike shop on Bicycle Row in Indianapolis, there were 6 bike shops, by the way, on Bicycle Row, and that was especially important in that era because Hay and Willits was an important shop. And the way that uniform came about was Taylor actually was a musician, unbeknownst to a lot of people. He played, according to his daughter Sydney, in a black only band of musicians, and that's where he got the name Major. They all had military uniforms, and they each had a designated a rank, depending on their how when they joined this little band of musicians. So, according to her, that was the real nuts and bolts behind that. And what was important, I believe, was that there was a race that took place, an annual event, and Taylor, because he had just really jumped into cycling, and by some accounts actually did some newspaper delivery, probably for the Indianapolis Star. But what was important was he was putting in miles, lots of miles, and so he was a strong kid, and he was demonstrating during this period where they were really ramping up the race. And on the morning of the race, he was doing back and forth drills and doing where he would stand on the saddle and ride with no hands, and riding the bicycle backwards, and doing things that really impressed the crowd, because that was something he taught himself, according to his autobiography. He taught himself to do that, and he was really proud of those skills. So Sam Hague, as part of his, Sam was a kind of a tyrant, I guess you could call it. He grabbed Major Taylor and he said, Major, as part of your tasks here, I want you in that race. And when he said that, Taylor was dumbfounded. He had never raced bicycles before. These were the prime athletes, and he had no idea what he was getting himself into. And he said, it's a handicap. So you would start first, and then the top riders would start last. That's how they did it, because there was so much variation on talent that it was important to start the novice riders first. Well, Major took one look at the assembled motley crew of recreational kids about his age, and he realized that they probably didn't have much in the way of skills. So he agreed to do it. And there was a gold medal for first place in this race. And so he jumped into it. He's just as quickly as he could get away from the pack, he did. And sure enough, there was a crash in the first turn, and he avoided that and went on and rode most of the 10-mile event on his own. But in the closing 100, 200 or 300 yards toward the finish, he was almost overtaken by the lead pack. And among those riders was the Indiana state champion, Walter Marmon, who would go on to great success in the Marmon automobile industry there in Indianapolis. And the Marmon, as you may know, if you know anything about motor racing, was the Marmon Wasp, with Ray Harmon driving, was the first winner of the Indianapolis 500. So Marmon was an important, at that time, a bicycle racer. And when Taylor actually beat him across the line, he was gaining on him very quickly, but he finished first, and the official didn't want to give it to him. There's this young black kid. This is not what we want. We want a white man of acclaim to win this race. And so they didn't want to give him the prize. And it was Walter Marmon himself who walked up to the official and says, he beat me fair and square, give him the medal. So they did. And that was his first, he was certainly a prodigy, and that was his first event. And it was almost an accident that he got into it. And there were other events, and I have to say he did somewhat alienate himself. He had an ego like a lot of young athletes, and his coach Bertie Munger, who was an amazing guy in and of himself, he was the owner of a bicycle factory there in Indianapolis, and Munger Cycles was a prominent contributor among about 100 other brands. They just were distributed nationwide. Munger prided himself in having the best racing equipment, the lightest equipment on the market. And of course, he built a bike for Major Taylor. And that was the first coaching alignment. And because of that, Bertie felt like he had a right to tell Major Taylor what to do, and he did, and he gave him good direction. It may not have been the best advice, but he gave it to him, and there was another event in Indianapolis, 75-mile race, which he also won. So he showed his versatility by winning both circuit races and distance races on the road. Not just the track, but the road.
He grows up there in Indianapolis. He works at the bike shop. He encounters Bernie Munger while he's working there. He wins that first race at about 13, and he stays in Indianapolis for a few years, 13 to like 16. Bernie Munger becomes his lifelong coach, right?
That's correct.
Meets him. He's impressed by him. And then he decides to move with Major Taylor to Massachusetts, right? They just so Major Taylor basically leaves Indianapolis for Massachusetts. Can you explain why? Why did he leave, and why did they choose Massachusetts?
They barred him from the track, and that was an event that took place because Bertie and another individual, George Catterson, had set up a challenge match that would have actually come into conflict with a seasoned professional rider who was trying to set a record for the mile. And it was done under pace. You have to remember that bicycles in the era were paced by tandems, triplets, quads, even quints. These bikes could generate more power because they were multi-riders on them. And they had a triplet set up for trying to remember his name, Walter Sanger, who was a well-known professional rider looking to retire and move into something different. And Sanger was there in Indianapolis to try to break the hour, or not the hour, but the 1 mile record. And Taylor was going to challenge it. And nobody knew about it. They literally brought him out in the shadows after Sanger had set the world record for the mile, successfully set the record. They brought Major Taylor out with his triplet. And these were all white riders who had trained very hard to help Major Taylor succeed with his mission. But the crowd didn't know. They surprised everybody, and they came out on the track, and sure enough, Major Taylor broke the world record, broke Sanger's brand new world record before the ink had even dried on the document. So it was not a popular move. And after that, this was done, I believe, on the Newby Loop, which was the bicycle track that was eventually replaced by the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So the Newby Loop, Arthur Newby was one of the founders of the Indy 500, by the way. After that, the word from the League of American Wheelmen officials was, he's not welcome in Indianapolis. We don't want him here. And so because of that, he realized, and then there was hostility at the bicycle factory, which had probably over 100 employees at the time. They didn't care for Major Taylor either. So out of that misunderstanding, if you will, Bertie decided he would scout the East Coast, and sure enough, he found a great location in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was a big, big industrial region near Boston. So he arranged to buy a building, actually bought the building, and they set up the factory. And so he took Major Taylor with him to Worcester by train, and the rest of Major's family did not leave. They stayed in Indianapolis. And so at that point, Major initially found housing at the YMCA in Worcester.
I think he stayed there in Massachusetts for a few years, right? He stays there. He trains with Mr. Munger. Mr. Munger trains him. And then when he's 18, he goes to New York City, to Madison Square Garden, where he debuts professionally. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. Yeah, it was the word from the athletic trainers of the day was that this young man has excellent speed. He's gifted. They, of course, didn't know this at the time, with that wonderful ingredient of fast white fibers, which are the fast moving fibers in the human body. So he was, and of course we know today that many African in general have that fast twitch recruitment of muscle fiber. So what was not well known at the time was how the punishment of a 6-day bicycle race would affect his speed. And it was generally thought by the experts that if Major Taylor were allowed to compete in Madison Square Garden 6-day race, which of course was the biggest race in the world at the time, and many Europeans and Americans were there to compete in it, it would destroy him. It literally would kill his speed, and he would amount to nothing further. That was the general consensus. Frankly, they didn't care. They wanted to use whatever resources Major Taylor had to win this event or place well in it. And he had already proven he could ride on the road, so they thought this is the perfect event for him. Well, the kid was 16 years old at the time. He was certainly not mature at that level in his life, and he suffered immensely to get through it. And at the time, there were no team racing, so whatever you did on your own. And I took note of the fact that the distance that he had covered would actually have won the race the previous year. He ended up finishing 7th overall, which was a remarkable feat, and made money doing it, all of which was sent back to his family. And Bertie looked after him. Bertie took care of him. And contrary to the athletic trainers of the era, it didn't affect his speed. If anything, it improved it. So they were completely wrong about how distance racing would affect athletic performance on a sprint circuit.
I think it's important. I learned from listening to you talk and doing some research that at the time, in the late 1800s, like 1890s, early 1900s, of all the sports, baseball, I assume soccer, uh, cycling was the biggest sport. It was on the world stage. It was the biggest sport. And perhaps that's due to, we don't have motorcycles yet. We don't have cars. We don't have car racing, motorcycle racing. We have horses and people can run, and we have coaches. But the bicycle was the first motor sport in a way, is how I picture it. And I remember you saying that during that time, a little bit after this time that we were talking about, he became the highest paid athlete in the world.
Yeah, that's correct. He was, for a period of maybe 6 or 7 years, the highest paid athlete in the world. Uh, I think it's important to point out that in this era, post-industrial revolution era, bicycles were the test bed for motorcycles. And in my museum here in Encinitas, California, I have one of the Orient pacing tandems that was used that actually became one of the first motorcycles. And the way they did this, they would hang a small single-cylinder, usually French motor, Didion Berton motor in the rear triangle of the tandem. And that would be operated by the stoker, or the rear seat man. And his job was to keep that motor running. And engines of the day were pretty primitive. Believe me, they were noisy. They would shoot out oil all over the track. They were a mess. But the fans loved it. And the captain who steered the bike, this thing was heavy. It would weigh probably 70 or 80 pounds, which for a bicycle is just really, really heavy. So the problem was that they were crude, they broke chains, they were, as I said, very, very dangerous, and they were getting more and more sophisticated in terms of motors. So overnight, I found this to be fascinating. Human pace, that is the tandems, triplets, quads, these really long bikes, steered by all of the top riders of the era, were displaced by the motor tandems. And the motor tandems, which became, of course, later on the first bicycles, they were all pedal driven, just like e-bikes today. They were pedal driven. It was very frustrating that, for example, there were events, and just over the course of a couple of years, all of the world records were just displaced by the motor tandems. But they would break down. The Stanley Steamer was a popular one that they had used. I mentioned the Orient, or I'm sorry, the Tribune and Orient bikes, which were made in the U.S., were also quite popular. So these machines created a huge interest in cycling, and the velodromes, well, they actually called them bike tracks, not velodrome. European called them the velodromes. So what happened was the bikes were becoming faster and faster and faster, and the tracks couldn't hold them. They had to rebuild all the tracks. There were over 200 bike tracks in the United States during this era. And they kept getting bigger, so they were aligning themselves with motors, and very soon it became motorcycle racing. And some of the stars of the era would ride these bikes, these motorcycles. I'll give you an example of Albert Champion, who was a French national cycling champion, won Paris-Roubaix, one of the biggest today, the biggest single-day classic. He won that and he immigrated to the United States and would bring these Didion-Bertone motors in crates over, and they would strap them to the tandems and create motorcycles. And Champion was an amazing guy. Not only did he create the first spark plugs, the first ignition systems, the first real wiring for automobiles and motorcycles, but and in that regard he was a genius, but his main focus was to race bicycles on Saturday, motorcycles on Sunday. That's what he did. And he and Major Taylor had some real battles, and he was probably just about as good as Taylor. So it was whoever would have the fastest motor would generally win. And that's the way it went, of course, in motor racing today. Whoever has the fastest bike or motorcycle or car generally is going to win the race.
It's amazing how things have gone from bicycles to motorcycles. Cycling is still very popular, especially in Europe, I would say. As you know better than most, the Tour de France, I guess, would be the biggest competition for cycling every year. Major Taylor, by the age of 19, he had 7 world records. And when he was 20 in 1899, he had the 1 mile world championship in Montreal. And then he would compete throughout the US. And there's an incident I heard you talk about, the one and only time he went south of the Mason-Dixon line. Could you tell that story?
I was Savannah, Georgia, and there was a really nice track in Savannah at the time. It would have been about 1894 or 5, and it was right after the 6-day race that he had ridden, and he was eager to try out. It was cold and is really cold in Chicago, the Midwest generally. This was before he actually landed in Chicago, but his focus was on training preparation. He got down there and he had an incident. Now, keep in mind that cycling in the South after the Civil War was immensely popular. There was a beautiful velodrome in Grant Park in Atlanta. I used to live in Atlanta, so I know about that. And the track's long gone, but the significance of this is that there were a lot of really talented players out there, athletes who were just focused on winning races. That's what they did. And Major Taylor had an encounter with a triplet out on a country road on the outskirts of Savannah. And the N word was pitched about at the time, and the triplet, the 3 riders on the triplet refused to pace him. They didn't want him sitting on their rear wheel, in other words. So because they were so adamant about not allowing Major Taylor to be paced by them, he just turned the tide and was strong enough at that point in his life that he could pace them. So they had difficulty staying with him in the morning traffic around Savannah. And so he really insulted them big time by doing that. And he didn't think anything of it. To him, it was, well, you won't pace. I can't pace you. I'll turn the tide, and you can. I'll give you pace. But that was, just an incredible insult. And he was on his way back to the rooming house where he was staying with his team. This is actually only a couple of days into his sojourn to Savannah. And he hadn't even had an opportunity to get to the track yet. Well, right after that incident on the triplet, a note tied to a rock came sailing through the bay window, and it basically said, Major Taylor, if you are not out of Savannah by sundown, you will be sorry. And at the time, he didn't even think about it. He telegraphed his his coach Munger back at the time and in Worcester and said, "What should I do? I don't know what to do." And they said, "Get out of Savannah immediately. Don't waste
Wow.
any more time." So he was on a steamer that afternoon. They got a steamer out of Savannah, and it was headed to the East Coast. So he got out, and as you mentioned, never again, to my knowledge, and I don't believe he ever crossed the Mason-Dixon line again, which of course was the demarcation between North and South, which existed even well after the Civil War, and that was the line that you never wanted to cross if you were black, especially. And
He had other hardships. Obviously, I was listening to a story that when he would compete all over the U.S. Uh, he couldn't stay at a lot of the hotels that other riders were staying at. He would have to come up with his own accommodations. I think he went to St. Louis once, where they told him that he could stay with the other riders, and then they kind of did a bait and switch on him. When he arrives, they tell him, actually, no, you can't stay with the other riders. You have to find your own accommodations. Could you talk about that story?
yes, the St. Louis event, really significant event. In St. Louis was a huge popular bicycle racing capital at the time, and NCAA championship points were on the line. Turned out there was a huge storm that came through, and they had no choice but to do the final on Sunday. Well, Major Taylor just said, "Nope, I'm not doing it." And at that point, there was one more race left on the calendar, and so he went to the promoter who actually sought him out. His name was Dunlop, and Dunlop was the promoter of the race, another race, the last one on the card, and that was in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And Cape Girardeau track was almost as nice as the one in St. Louis, but it would have represented the final event, which you draw points from. And Taylor was actually close to the lead. I believe he might have even been leading at that point. And as it turned out, Dunlop told him, "No problem, you can stay in my hotel. I own a hotel there, and you may eat in the dining room." And when he got to Cape Girardeau by train, they did indeed pull a bait and switch on him. And the excuse that Dunlop used was, "Well, I'm sorry, Major Taylor, but the other riders refused to have you stay in the hotel." And part of this, I believe, was part of his alienation on because of his Christian upbringing and the fact that he was black. They just couldn't accept that. So he ended up leaving Cape Girardeau. He was a principled man, and he wasn't about to compromise. It didn't matter to him. The championship was important, but his belief that God was with him on that bicycle and would protect him from all harm was more important to him. And so he did not stay in Cape Girardeau. He took the train back to Worcester, and it so happened that the only other competitor who could give him a run for his money was a gentleman named Eddie Bald, who probably was as racist as the others. But Bald had an opportunity to join an off-Broadway. He was an actor, too, by the way, and an off-Broadway production. And so he jumped at that. He was tired of bicycle racing. It was a hard sport. So he wanted to try a new profession. So he jumped in at this opportunity to act. Consequently, the title was uncontested. And it isn't clear whether Major Taylor won that or not. But either way, they fined him. They fined him a $500 fine, which was an astronomical amount of money in the day. And his sponsor, which would have been Ivor Johnson, Ivor Johnson's Arms and Cycles and Fred Johnson was his close ally, and he paid the fine so Major Taylor could continue racing the next season.
Wow. Yeah, he went through so much hardship. Biking, as you know better than most, is extremely grueling. He's facing all this racism. He's facing all this hardship. But it seems like he was strong-willed. It seemed like he had a compass, and he lived with that compass through all his life. He competed in the U.S. and then he was very popular in Europe, I understand, too. So he's racing in the U.S. and then they want him in Europe. I think they tried to get him over there for a couple of years so he can compete against them. So he takes this, I guess, boat ride across the Atlantic to Europe, and he's seen as a star, right? How is his treatment in Europe different than it was in the U.S.?
He had an opportunity to sign a contract early on. That was several years earlier than that, right after his World Championship victory in Montreal. He had a chance to sign a contract which included Sunday racing. Well, that was it would have been $700,000-800,000 at the time. Plus, he got all of his race win purse money, and he didn't have to share it with anybody, not even his manager. So that would have been a huge incentive to go and race in Europe. That contract was made by Victor Brier, who was a very prominent French promoter of the day, and he turned it down. He said, "I can't do it. Sunday racing." So they negotiated eventually, and it took over a year to get the negotiation finalized, and the negotiation ended up giving him about half of what he had originally been promised, and that was because of the rule about the Sunday racing. Well, the significance of this on a world stage is that Major Taylor is the only athlete in history to ever be so sought after that they literally changed the structure of racing in Europe. And not just France, but throughout the entire continent. And the Europeans, I believe, loved their opera on Saturday, and bicycle racing was the odds-on favorite sport on Sunday. They would go to the velodrome on Sunday. So they switched around somehow. It's not known exactly how they did it, but they literally changed the structure of bicycle racing in Europe to accommodate Major Taylor. And that worked for a while. But long term, it didn't. He did it because you have to remember it's a long, as you said, boat ride across the Atlantic, and it was rough. It was the trip was rough. He didn't do well in ships, and he had a lot of difficulty getting there. He couldn't ride his rollers, so his training suffered because of it. So when he got there, he did not distinguish himself as the grand champion of the United States. He eventually, after several weeks of continual training, started winning races. And over a period of several months, he traveled throughout the various countries in Europe. And while he lost to a number of the champions of Europe early on, he eventually, by the time the tour was over, had beaten all of them, including the great Edmond Jacquelin from France, who was a, I guess you could call him a rabble rouser. He was, because he was so good, he was a plebeian favorite, and the French loved him, especially the great unwashed, as I would call them, and because of that, he did some things that were really kind of nasty toward Major Taylor, and he beat him in his first match, and beat him handily. So this was early because Taylor hadn't developed his strength from the trip yet. So he demanded a rematch, and he got it. Toward the end of the tour, he went back against Jacquelin, who, by the way, was not only the French champion, he was a world champion. So he was the newly crowned world champion at that point. And Major Taylor beat him 2 straight, just swamped him, handed Jacquelin the worst defeat of his career.
Oh, wow.
So the French press, after the first loss to Jacquelin, portrayed him. They would do these. There's a photograph in the book of this caricature where they expanded his lips and he lengthened his head to make him have this stereotypical African look that was just absolutely racist, and that was done by Au Grand Air, the primary sporting publication of the day, had done this, and they love to do things like that. So the racism that was displayed in Europe was much more subtle and comical. In the United States, it was just overt, nasty racism. So there was a difference there. The French were much more polite in the way they portrayed. But after beating Major Taylor, he thumbed his nose at him like you're nothing compared to me. And so that sort of insult, Major Taylor used that to his advantage, and he stored all of these memories, and it created a fire inside I believe his real spirit would come out after incidents like that, which happened back in the U.S. Frequently when he had to race mass start events. In Europe, it was mostly mano a mano, but in the U.S., it was usually a field, and there'd be times when a third of the field was riding not to win, but to make sure that Taylor didn't win.
Can you tell me how, I've heard you describe him physically. He wasn't an imposing man. He was, I think, 5'6" to 5'7". The way he would ride, you said, was different than most. He would have a low profile, try and reduce wind resistance. It seemed like he had these, he'd think about it mechanically and try and improve himself or his speed by making adjustments to the bike, how he sat in the bike. Can you talk about that?
Well, I alluded to his engineering prowess earlier on, but Bertie taught him well. He was a machinist by trade. He learned the tool and die. In the era, you learn skills. You became a craftsman at this or that, and tool and die was something he was very interested in. He hand forged some bicycle stems that were totally unique for the era. They were adjustable. So unlike previous stems, which of course connects the handlebars to the bicycle, designed a adjustable stem so that he could slide his weight back in the saddle and get a lower aerodynamic profile. So one of the most prominent photographs of Major Taylor shows him with a bent elbow position. Well, this was not the norm at the time at all, and I think it was well before the science of aerodynamics had ever even been considered by bicycle racers. And you look at some of the champions of the day, Floyd McFarland, especially McFarland because he was about 6'4". He was one of Major Taylor's biggest opponents, and he set really high on the bike. Well, that created like an air block. When you don't have a lot of power to begin with, in this case 400 or 500 watts is not a lot of power so you want to make yourself as slippery as possible, and Taylor did this to his advantage, and he created that stem, and none of the other riders, to my knowledge, would use it because he had created it. It found its way into production on a lot of the Ivor Johnson bicycles because it was a brilliant idea. But it didn't really have much significance in the track. But Taylor knew that he could get low on the bike, and as you said, he was a small man, about 5'6", and he could wedge his way through holes in the pack that a larger rider couldn't get through. So he was extremely adept, partly because of his acrobatic skill set that he had developed early on at maneuvering through holes in the pack. And that's how he would win races. So unlike the white riders, many of them, like Eddie Bald, who had pacers pacing him, he had to do it on his own. He had nobody there to help him.
Yeah, he did it all himself. He would make these adjustments to improve his time. He was extremely fast. Is that common in bikers now? Or is it an advantage to be a biker that's taller or not as tall? Or is is every bike rider different?
Well, that's a good question. I think that it's a given that a bigger, taller athlete is going to have greater power reserves. So yes, if you're taller, especially height is an important consideration, then you're going to give up some of that power due to the aerodynamic disadvantage that your profile presents to the wind. So you want to, I think the ideal size for a bicycle racer is probably not much larger than a jockey, actually. But those of us who are taller, I raced at 6'1", we have a disadvantage, and that is lessened by the position that we choose on the bike. So we want to get as low as possible. Today, bikes are aerodynamic, and they're designed to give the rider a low profile. So bikes of this era were made out of steel instead of carbon fiber. They were heavier, and nobody ever really considered that a round tube is not as smooth going through the wind as a wing-shaped tube.
So Major Taylor tours Europe, and between the ages of like 22 to 25, he goes to Europe. Then he goes to Australia, right? I mean, that had to be a really long boat ride. And then his daughter is born there. I believe he got married and had one daughter in Sydney, Australia. Was his experience in Australia similar to Europe?
Well, when he initially arrived in Sydney, he let's see, that was I'm trying to remember the promoter who brought him over. This is how I remember things by the promotion. Originally, he was brought over with the idea that he's going to showcase his talents, so that a lot of the events were designed for him, and he excelled. I don't think he really lost a race in Australia, and the competition, because there was a large purse available to him for the first 2 years. He would travel back and forth, which was a long way down under, but the money he was making was so strong that, sure enough, the American riders soon figured out that they could go down there and they could employ the same techniques that they used to beat Major Taylor in the U.S. And there was a lot of underhanded stuff that took place in Australia. He raced there for, I believe, 4 seasons. And at the end of the 4th season, he swore he would never come back. Because although it had been just a wonderful experience in the beginning, and of course, as you mentioned, his daughter Sydney was born in Sydney, Australia, I believe 1902, but it ended up being just like the competition in the U.S. So he was gradually becoming soured on bicycle racing, but realized that he needed to cement his future by continuing to compete for as long as he possibly could. And it was down there that he had a horrible crash. One of the very first crashes of his entire career occurred in Australia, and he was hurt badly. Although he didn't break anything, he did a lot of damage, a lot of abrasions. And the rider who took him down was an American. I believe it was Hardy Downing who took him down, and Downing would later become a world champion himself. But on this particular occasion, he chopped Taylor. In other words, put his front wheel into his spokes. Well, in his absolute prime, Taylor probably could have avoided that. But here he is competing now on about his 10th season. And his reaction time probably wasn't as quick as it had been. And Downham took him down, took all the spokes, or a good number of spokes, out of his front wheel, and he went down, went over the handlebars, crashed, and they DQ'd Downing at the time for the rest of the season, I think. And in spite of his injuries, he came back about 3 weeks later and was bandaged up heavily, and he came back and was back in the game.
So he's competing all of these years. He's a famous star. He's making a lot of money. Everyone's working against him. And then he goes back to the U.S. and he retires. He retires around the age of 32 from professional cycling. It's hard for me to find what happens after that. Can you talk about what happens to him after he retires?
Well, it's all in the Black Cyclone. None of the the biographies really go into a whole lot of detail about what happened. But initially, I have in my files a copy of his draft deferment during World War I. He was a renowned well, I won't, probably that's a little strong. He was a good machinist who was able to get a draft deferment in World War I because of his skills at making armaments and such for the war effort. Well, it turned out that his contribution in that arena took place with something that was very close to his bicycle racing. It was a wheel that a spoked wheel that was, I'll describe it to you this way by telling you what the crisis was. Rubber at the time all grew on trees or came out of trees, mostly in South America. And because Goodyear or Firestone had yet to create a chemistry to manufacture rubber, the rubber of the era was extremely good. It didn't wear out. I have tires in my museum that were over 130 years old with no cracks. So the natural latex rubber was just awesome, but it was often described by the racers at the time as being too good. It didn't wear out, and it was a little bit slippery on smooth surfaces. So there was a shortage of natural fiber rubber. Taylor created a brilliant idea, and it improved the suspensions of the cars of the day. It was a spring radially, trying to describe this is never easy. It was a radially built wheel that had radial springs attached to the hub. So they radiated out from to the rim. And the rim was covered with natural latex fiber rubber. So these sections of rubber that hardly ever wore out created a almost uniform suspension for the automobile of the day. And they were used successfully on trucks and mostly heavy vehicles that had very, very poor suspensions. You have to remember that cars of the era had, basically wagon technology. A leaf spring usually created a partial suspension, but most of them were so stiffly sprung they didn't even have shock absorbers. So he created something that was in demand. The problem was that he couldn't get supply on it. He had a contract, we believe, with Pierce Arrow, which was a state-of-the-art automobile at the time, but he could not get components for it. And before he could get the componentry, the rubber, the metal to build the springs, the rims for the wheel, the hubs, and so forth, somebody beat him to the punch, and his version of it never was actually created. He built prototypes for his trucks and his own sports car of the day, the Stutz Bearcat that he had, and he actually proved that the system works beautifully, but as I said, somebody beat him to the punch, and it never saw the production that he had so wanted, and almost $30,000, which in the day would have been an astronomical amount of money today, was used up in the process of doing that. So that cost him. He owned real estate in Worcester, some triplet buildings that he rented out, and he was very friendly to his fellow congregation members in the church, and they didn't always pay their rent on time. They took advantage of Major Taylor, so that didn't go down well, and he eventually lost all of them. So at the end of his life, it's been said that he did have some money, but I don't think a lot of it. And he created his own autobiography. I don't know how many copies of that were out there. Um, it's a very rare book today. I own one copy signed by Major Taylor. Uh, so I don't have a clue as to how many of those books are still available, but as I said, they are rare books, and it tells old story, or his story, as it were, and those accompanied him to Chicago, where he was his last home.
So when he came back to the U.S., he's retired at 32. He publishes that autobiography. I believe it's called "The Fastest Bicycle Rider in the World."
1929, yes.
1920. He was 49 at that age. So there's between 32 and 49. There's 17 years. He goes back to Worcester. He has this money. He has some real estate, and then during that time, he moves. I guess he doesn't have a very good financial situation. He kind of loses the money, or most of it, and moves to Chicago with his book published at the age of 49, and then he stays in Chicago. What happened there? Did he have like a falling out with his family? Is he still in contact with them?
They were not divorced, but they were living in separate cities at the time. His wife Daisy and daughter Sydney eventually left Massachusetts and moved to New York City, I believe it was, and that's where they were. And they didn't even know that he was having difficulties. I suppose communication in the day was not as easy as it is today. So they were unaware that he had passed away, and he died in the Cook County Hospital and was buried in a pauper's grave. Very much an Amadeus kind of departing from this world. Sad, perhaps, but his acclaim has since changed directions considerably. There are over 250 clubs, Major Taylor cycling clubs, worldwide. Many of them in the U.S. Worcester, Massachusetts has a boulevard named after him. A bronze statue and frieze at the public library in Worcester. Indianapolis also honors him with a velodrome. The archives, the Major Taylor archives, are at the Indiana State Museum. If anyone is interested in going to see, I believe they actually have one of his original bicycles, which probably fewer than 3 of them exist today.
So he moved to Chicago, and he dies at the age of 53. I think the average African American at that time lived to about 47. Is what I think I've heard you say. So he lived 6 years longer than most men. When he died, they buried him in a unmarked grave because they didn't know who he was, and he was buried there. And then several years later, in 1948, which is about 16 years later, several cyclist organizations or a group of cyclists exhumed his body and reinterred him into a proper grave there in Illinois, where he's buried today.
Also, Glenmont Memorial Cemetery in Chicago, but it's a much nicer portion of the cemetery. I think there was some marker on his grave because they had to keep track, but the body was exhumed by Frank Schwinn of Schwinn Bicycles, a very prominent bicycle that had been resurrected after World War II, and the Schwinn bicycle factory had been turned into a airplane parts manufacturing. But after the war, the bikes were very popular. Schwinn bicycles were so popular that it was a wealthy company, and Frank Schwinn had the body exhumed about 10 years later and placed in this new section of the cemetery. And at that time, he was honored, and they did a ceremony, and so he was at that 10 years after his death. He was really starting to become more acclaimed at that point, but still unknown, largely because bicycle racing was disappearing as a popular sporting venue.
And then you were both inducted into the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame in 1989. Why do you think he was inducted so late?
Well, good reason would be that the Cycling Hall of Fame was being resurrected in 1987. The real establishment of bicycle racing was on the East Coast, and it was the original Hall of Fame was in, I think, first Staten Island, New York, and then it moved to Somerville, New Jersey, which is a very popular, there's a very popular race there, Tour of Somerville, every year. And many of the participants, those who were still around, decided that Somerville would be the place for the Hall of Fame. And it has since moved to Davis, California, and expanded considerably. So I was inducted along with Taylor in 1989. So it was either 88 or 89. So I think we were either the second class or the third class inducted into the Hall of Fame.
So he was actually inducted pretty quickly then into the
posthumously, but with the idea that there were two categories in the Hall of Fame today. There was the modern category, which included myself and ex teammate Audrey McElmurray, and then there was the what they referred to as the ancients, those who were part of the bicycle racing in that golden era back at the turn of the century.
When you read his autobiography, what message do you think he was trying to leave in writing his autobiography?
Oh, it was really clear. He wanted first of all to cement his acclaim on the sport of cycling. He wanted to be understood and appreciated, which is only natural. And he also had another agenda, and that was to promote cycling initially for young black athletes coming up. And I think today we should probably give him more credit because he was far more aware of way before the civil rights movement took off in the 60s, and the term was not even used in his era. But he understood that racism was bad and that we needed to do something about it. There were still a lot of lynchings, even during the period where he was toward the end of his life. And it took until the 1960s for that to change. But some of his acquaintances were people like W.B. Du Bois, who was the founder of the NAACP. Crisis Magazine was another of Du Bois' endeavor. Those people, I'm trying to think of who else we should give thought to. Booker T. Washington, before Du Bois, was an acquaintance who talked frequently about the importance of athletics and the strength of Major Taylor. They were good friends, actually, and Booker T promoted Major Taylor whenever he possibly could, especially to young African Americans. I would say that Booker T had a much more, if I could use the term Uncle Tom's approach to let things happen naturally. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois did not take that approach at all. He was much more, his day, radical, I would say. But Taylor knew both of them and did what he could to promote. I remember very clearly a letter that I have actually in my archives from Taylor to Du Bois, where he talks about the importance of giving these young athletes a chance. Hallmark letter that was really important. And, not a lot happened after that, but they all made an effort to keep the flame burning, shall we say.
So, Mr. Howard, a lot of young boys have childhood heroes, right? A lot of us have childhood heroes, and they're usually someone we always look up to. They're someone that has a big influence on our lives, someone we aspire to be. Most people don't investigate the lives and write books about their childhood heroes like you did of Major Taylor. You've written this book, you've done research, you've traveled, you've talked to his daughter several times, leaving from where you were at to go visit her to get the story. Why did you take that extra step? What drew you to him and his story specifically?
He was a complicated man, and I wanted to learn as much about what motivated him as possible. I don't know that I can answer the question as thoroughly as I would like, but I can tell you that in spite of his enigmatic personality and his difficulties at times communicating to his own family, I could relate to that because of that. Cyclists tend to be a little bit going in that direction because their personalities are give, and support. The sport is ruthless at times. It's dangerous. It's expensive. It's all of those ingredients are complicated. And while Major Taylor had, according to his daughter, a great sense of humor, it was period chemistry, and it probably wouldn't be as funny today as it was back in that era. And you will read in my book, The Black Cyclone, just exactly what some of those incidents were all about, what motivated them. And I think that Major Taylor was a difficult man to follow and a difficult man to understand at times. But other times he was quite lucid about his experiences. It's hard to pin him down.
Yeah, he was an incredible man. You've dedicated a lot of your life to telling his story. And if it wasn't for you, I would not have learned about him. So I must thank you from that perspective.
Thank you, Seraphin. I appreciate that.
Yes, sir, Mr. Howard. So what message do you hope listeners take away from Taylor's story?
He harbored no animosity toward those who had difficulty understanding him, and some of which were the overt racists that showed him no kindness whatsoever. He harbored no ill regard toward these people. He believed very much that the expression of anger was something that would burden your soul, and that it was important to get past that. And I think that's the lesson that is so critical in today's world. That's how I see him. And You know, he may in his autobiography he talks about the importance of giving back, and some of his worst moments where he was really treated badly by people, fellow cyclists, for example. He wrote kindly of them in his autobiography, and you know, while he would describe the things that they did to him, in the end, he came back with he was a great champion. I remember reading about Floyd McFarland, who treated him very badly, and he called him a great champion. And I was very fortunate to run across some of his original, some people who had actually raced with him when they were very, very young, like Alf Goulet, who was an Aussie who immigrated to the U.S. and became a citizen. And Goulet had loaned him his favorite bicycle, he said. And that bicycle was used by Major Taylor at the Newark Velodrome in 1917 to win his final race. That was a real poignant period of my research where I could sit down with Alf, and I literally caught him in the closing months of his life. So, I mean, that description of how grateful Major Taylor was and how kindly he was toward all of those people that had treated him poorly at that Newark event. And they all, you know, he wouldn't drink alcohol, but they all sat down and had a drink and kind of buried the hatchet, so to speak. And I think that's how I would think that he should be remembered as someone who never held a grudge.
Yeah, he sounds like he was an incredible man. So, Mr. John Howard, where can people find out more about you, and where can they purchase your book?
Well, Barnes and Noble has the book in their catalog. It's available on Amazon. We make almost nothing off Amazon sales, but it is available on Amazon. It's also available on our website, which is majortaylorstory.com. majortaylorstory.com. That's simple. And you will see photographs, some of Mona Mills' portraits of Major Taylor that are in black and white in the book, but you'll see them in color. Mona, I had her commissioned to paint those. And if you're looking for more history, not actually included in the book, then majortaylorstory.com. You can buy it off our website.
Great. Yeah, I'll put the website and the links in the show notes. Well, Mr. Howard, thank you so much for being with me today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Your life is an inspiration. Your dedication to Major Taylor's life and history and all the work you've done to keep his story and spirit alive is inspirational for a lot of people. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Seraphin. It's been a pleasure.